So lovely to have everybody here, and an exciting day ahead, I hope, for both of us. What I want to do is just start with a little story. When I was on holiday in the last week in August, and I came back after a week to find my kitchen infested with flies, as sometimes you do, and these were big blue bottle flies, and although opening the windows and things, it couldn't get rid of them all, and I had to resort to Raid, the fly spray. Now, this is a pesticide which is widely available in shops, and so I sprayed the flies in the kitchen window there, and forgot about the nice bunch of basil just underneath there. But bearing in mind that Raid is a pesticide and not a herbicide, you can imagine my surprise after 2 days later when this is what I saw. Okay, so this is, remember, Raid is perfectly safe for human beings, all right? And it's lethal for insects, especially wasps and flies, but I was amazed that it could do that to a plant. And if it can do that to a plant, think what it can do with humans. And what we're going to see, and you'll be amazed at as we go along, how many household chemicals that we use and how many chemicals we put on our face and our bodies are gender benders or hormone disruptors. And so I'm going to show you how you can do this and how we can test each other as time goes on for these gender bender chemicals. Because the amount of chemicals that people put on their bodies is just amazing. Most women are considered to put 5 kilograms per year. And that most of these chemicals are hormone disruptors, and particularly for the estrogens. And this applies for men as well, very, very much, because males are getting enormous amounts of prostate cancer. Prostate cancer is the biggest cancer now in males, and nobody seems to be doing anything about the prevention of it. Everybody's talking about treatment, but nothing to do with prevention. And what we've got to try and find out is where these chemicals are coming from, and which chemicals individually work or adverse for you, and create these changes. And it's quite horrific how many target the testes, and how many toxins, environmental toxins will, and how many metals will target the testes in the male and target the ovaries in the women. So we've got a lot of things to discuss, and I'll be demonstrating. So epigenetics is about how perception, as our perception of the world through our 5 senses, can alter our genetic expression. So how perception alters our genes. And we know from basic school anatomy and physiology and genetics that we have 2 types biologically. We have a genotype and a phenotype. And the genotype is exactly what your inherited genes, which you've obviously inherited from your mum and dad and forefathers, will maximally express. And what we're going to call this is a state of being. And the phenotype is how they are expressing themselves right now. So right now, in other words, are you at your very best for your genotype? We can call this the current state of being. So what you have is a genotype or a state of being when you are 100%, and you have a state of being what you are at this particular time. And some people are 100% right now. Hopefully, if they've been patients of ours, that they're at 100% right now. So what we're going to do is use Joe Dispenza, who we talked about in last year's update in his book Evolving Your Brain, and use the word state of being as an expression of health and wellness. So when we combine health, which is more or less your genetic predisposition, and your wellness, which is your state now, we'll call it a state of being, so what your current state of being is. So the first thing is to establish what our benchmark is, and every one of us has had a state of being when we've been 100% for you. So this is all relative. Okay? So I may have had been 100% at age 10, and I may be 90 or 80 or 70% now. But that's relative. So I could, in fact, work myself towards being better than 100% at a later date if I used the right nutrients and detoxified and did the right amount of exercise. So there was a time period in your life, and this is the first challenge we're going to do, and we can actually do this on each other, i.e. when your health and well-being calibrated at 100% for you. So we're going to start off. What I used to do when I first did this in the early summer was starting off from birth and working our way up in 5-year, 10-year increments to whatever the current age of the person is. And then we found that some people, the best they'd ever been, there was no time when they were 100%, the best they were was when they were sort of between 5 and 10 years of age. And maybe they were 60, 70% of what they could have been. And this seemed very strange. And then somebody in the seminar I was giving in Los Angeles said, well, you've forgotten one vital period of your life. So I said, well, between birth and where you are now, when else was there? And of course, there's conception to birth. And it's amazing how many people were at their best when they were in their mummy's tummy, long before they came out. As soon as they came out, or within a very short period of time, they were suffering then from malnutrition, from the mother's diet, or from poor diet for them, or environmental toxins from the mother and the environment. So we must remember that a very important time is the moment of conception to birth, and patients always stare at you when you say that to them. They look in amazement that you actually asked that question. And then I go from birth to 10, depending obviously on the age of the patient. You know, if you've got a 70-year-old patient, you don't want to be doing it in 5-year increments. But if you've got a 25-year-old, you might want to do age 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, and so on. So normally in a middle-aged person, I'll go to between birth and 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 35, etc., and work my way up. So if I could just demonstrate that. So perhaps there's a good man here. Looks very healthy. Yes. Don't thank me because you don't know what you are yet. Here you are, if you put yourself down there. But you can do this on each other just to know where you are right this particular moment. So what we're going to do is we're going to say on a scale of 1 to 100. And in this case, we're going to use 1 to 100, in other words, a percentage, because we're talking about physical biochemistry. When we look in the mind, and we're looking at more esoteric, spiritual, quantum part, we'll use the scale of 1 to 1,000, the exponential. But we'll use the scale of 1 to 100 first of all. So the time period in your life when you calibrated at 100% in your state of being, in other words, your health and wellness, was between conception and birth. Paul? Okay, between birth and 10. Between 10 and 20. How old are you now?
36.
He's 36, so 20 to 25. So those were good years. 25 to 30, 30 to 35, 35 onwards. Okay, so 35 onwards. So 20 to 25. So he's past his best by the looks of it. The trouble is he didn't know that those were the best years and didn't make the most of them. But what our aim now is that we will get him back to that, don't worry, by the end of the day. Okay, so that's the first challenge that you're going to do, is what period of your life did you calibrate at 100%? And that would be officially your genotype, so in other words, the best that you have been for you. So remember, it's all relative, because the best that another person may be at a lower level of health, but that's the best they've been. So this would be the expression of the gene. So the phenotype is how they actually are now, taking into consideration their emotional stresses, their biological stresses with toxins and deficiencies and any mechanical problems. So right now, with 20 to 25 being 100%, your state of being right now calibrates as a percentage at 90% or higher. Paul? At 80% or higher. At 85%. At 80%. So here we got 80% of what he was when he was 20 to 25. And he's still only 37, did you say?
Yeah.
37. But he's probably feeling a lot older than that because he's 80%. Now, 80% isn't dreadful, but there's room for improvement, let's say. So don't give the patient too much disappointment, saying, you know, we'll get you back. We've got the benchmark now to aim towards getting. We've got somewhere where we can get to. So by the end of the day, we've got to get you to score 100%. Okay?
In the same day?
In the same day, yes. Within the same treatment session, okay? We've got to find the keys to be able to open this up. And the keys are going to be looking at, obviously, the usual 3 sides of the triangle, like the structure mechanics. We're going to be looking at the chemistry, but particular emphasis on the toxins and being able to detoxify radiations, chemicals, and toxic metals. Any nutritional deficiencies which might be there. But then we're going to enter into the realms of the mind, within the body, the neurological networks within the brain, which is called the subconscious mind, and then into the conscious mind, or the thinking, decision-making. So we're going to fix those all into perspective, all 4 aspects: the consciousness, the subconscious, the physical, and the chemistry. Okay, then you'll be 100%. So you pop back. So if you'd like to just try this, use a deltoid muscle on the person next to you and see. Sometimes people aren't switched on and off initially, so discard them. Let's waste time on that. But just break the ice with your neighbour and just do a quick deltoid test and ask them, make the challenge, you to them, so you're making a conscious question to their subconscious mind. Okay? So I'll flick back on the questions there. So the first one is, there was a time period in your life when your state of being calibrated at 100%. So now you have your mission by the end of the day to know the answers as to why your partner's health isn't 100%. Shh. If your partner's health is 100%, that's good. And maybe we can improve on that. So there's no need to necessarily stop because you calibrated 100%. Doesn't mean you're going to be 110, but it's relative. So sometimes people actually, their health improves when they're put on the right pathway as they get older, rather than when they're younger. Okay. So what I found and observed in my own practice in doing this over about a 6-month period is that the most common times are these. So for women, it's 30 to 35. I always, when I've done these seminars, ask women when they felt their best, and the usual answer is before they had children. Once having the children, then they've got a permanent state of anxiety and tiredness and stress and things. But it's interesting that 30 to 35 seems to be the biological time when women will say that they were at their best. And in men, it's a little later, which surprised me, was 40 to 45. So when a man gets to 46, very often they're on the way down. 45 to 50, they don't feel as good as what they did, and 50 to 60 and so on. But then again, there's no reason why we can't get back if we know the clues as to what the difference is between 80% and 100% as in this case. What we did, or what you did as well, is you verbalized the statement to the patient. Okay? So you told them auditorily, and they heard and listened, but they actually didn't have to understand. They did listen and they understood it, and some patients will try and attempt to answer the question. And you say, no, we'll do it with the muscle test. Now, the subconscious mind, as we're going to learn, is a database. There's nobody in there. It's just the memory of everything that's happened through our receptor input. But everything that's ever happened to you is stored in there. And the control of the muscles is actually under the control of the subconscious mind, because you don't have to think about moving and walking, so it's all subconscious. It's all parietal lobe, cerebellum, etc. So the muscle power and the control of the muscles is under the control of the subconscious mind. And what you're doing is you're making a conscious statement and asking the person to compare that with their subconscious. And if the two agree, the person remains strong throughout the neuromuscular system. And if they disagree, consciously you're asking a question, I'm 100% now, the subconscious is saying, oh no, you're not. And what you're finding out is the answer. So the person to ask about how a person is really is the person. They're the only ones who know. And consciously, they don't know, because everybody says, I'm fine, don't they, when you ask them how they are. And then you find some people come in at very low levels, and they don't look that bad. But when you say you're actually calibrating at only 50% of what you were 10 years ago, they say, yeah, you're right, that's exactly how I feel. Okay? So they're making that decision, not us. So most popular times, 30 to 35 for women, 40 to 45 for men. But there are people who are conception to birth and in childhood. That's just my observation. You might find it's totally different. And that might be to do with where I live or where the patients live. You know, you might find it's different if you lived in an inner city area or in a completely rural part. So we've done that one. So a state of being, as I said, depends upon the so-called three sides of the triangle, the structure, biochemistry, and the emotions. And the emotions, as we get into talking about these, are going to be the subconscious emotions, which is the database or memory, and the conscious mind, or the thinking one, which is going to include the bits which we don't think about, but the ideas that we've taken on, they're called the unconscious. So the structure and the biochemistry together, we could call the body. The subconscious, which is the hardwiring or the neural netting within the brain of all our memory, we'll call the mind. So the mind is really part of the physical body, but it's the electrical connections made in the brain. And the spirit is that decision-making which doesn't live in the brain, that doesn't have a location or a space, which we'll call consciousness at the moment. All three, as you must gather, must be in harmony, in perfect harmony or balance for perfect health. So this brings us now to thinking there's a link between the conscious, the subconscious, and the body. And as we're going to learn, all three are the same thing. One is a different expression and a different form of the others. Okay? Just as we've got water can be steam, it can be water, and it can be ice. but it's still H2O. And same thing here, that the conscious part of us, the thinking part, the mind, which is the memory, becomes the body. So the body, the mind, and the spirit are all part of one thing, and what we're going to see is how they all interrelate. Therefore, if we're out of harmony, we're going to be out of harmony throughout all three. So when you find a physical wreck of a person, and biochemical wreck, you know that underneath there a wreck in their mind as well, and in their consciousness. Okay? So we can access through the body what's happening in the mind, and vice versa. But what we've got to determine is, does the patient's problem, as we unfold it, should we start in the consciousness and work to the subconscious to the body, or should we start the other way around with the body, then go to the mind, and then go to the spiritual part? Okay, and that's how we're going to do this over the course of the day. So we need to get perfect health, has to be perfect harmony or balance. So with the development of quantum physics in the 1920s, changed the world as we see it, and thought we understood from a material world, in other words, a world of solid structure made of atoms, to one of energy. And it's been shown that if you were to send a camera into an atom, made a small enough camera in there, you'd actually find there was nothing there. There would be no pictures when you came out the other side. That electrons are nothing more than spins of energy, whirls or vortices of energy, and the same with the neutron and the proton. So at the end of the day, everything is energy. It's not a physical material world, it's an energetic one. And from the development of quantum physics in the 1920s, we now have cell phones, and we have computers, and we sent people up to the moon. So atoms were discovered to be bundles of energy and not solid matter as previously thought. As all three aspects of the state of being should be in harmony, disharmony would mean an imbalance in the person's energy fields. In other words, how the Chinese have measured these for centuries, called meridians or flows of biological energy. In Chinese medicine, they call this qi, and in Ayurvedic medicine, they call it prana, otherwise known as the breath of life or the vitality or the spirit. So your vitality is different from your ATP of your body. So your ATP in your chemistry of your body would be considered to be the physical component of the body, how you would measure that. But the quantum part, the actual wavelength or the energy in a different form, would be your vitality or your qi. Meridians are energy channels that we know that these energies flow throughout the body in specific and predictable patterns. And we can measure meridian imbalances at specific meridian or acupuncture points. Meridians are waves of energy forming the greater structure of the body in the wave pattern called the matrix. So energy is composed of both wavelengths and frequencies. So to measure energy, we can measure it when it changes its form, and we measure its wavelength, which is the wave coming up and down, and we measure the frequency of how many waves there are per second. Thus, each meridian has a specific color, which is also a wavelength or frequency associated with it. So every meridian has a wavelength associated with it and a specific sound. And the sounds are within the audible frequencies, as we're going to see, on a very low level. So every meridian, every energy, which meridians are, we measure in wavelengths or frequencies, and these are interchangeable, as we'll see. So if we go through the common wavelength connection, on the left we have frequency, and on the right we have wavelengths. And these are the very, very short wavelengths on the top part here. The shortest ones which are measurable are the gamma rays, which penetrate through material. Coming down and getting slightly longer, but still very small, are the hard X-rays, and then the X-rays, and then the so-called soft X-rays. And then we come into the realm of ultraviolet. This is just beyond the human visibility, and we see that the human visibility of the 7 colors of the rainbow, see how small that is? Between 400 nanometers and 775 nanometers is all we see in this physical material world. But everything else is way beyond what we can comprehend. And as the wavelengths gets longer, we go into the infrared zone. And the infrared zone gets longer and longer until we come into television, radio waves, and we get longer and longer and longer, and then we're into radar, etc. So the interchange here is the frequency on the left-hand side. We have what we can audibly hear in octaves, which is measured in octaves. And each octave has a measurable counterpart on the wavelength side of a color. So sound and color, again, are interchangeable. And what we'll find is that frequency, which is how we measure sound on the left here, equals the speed of light, c, over the wavelength. Okay, so that gives us our number of frequencies per second. Or put round the other way, the wavelength can be converted from the speed of light over the frequency. So both of these are interchangeable. Therefore, it makes possible to alter energies. We can do this straight away in two ways. We could use colour on one side, or we could use sound on the other. So harmonics on one side could be good, and they could be bad. And the same colours could be good, or colours could be bad. And what we're going to see a little later on is that the receptor sites on every cell membrane are little channels which allow food and nutrients and chemical messengers to get in and out of the cell. And these open and they shut. And it's almost imperceivable how they open and shut, the speed that they shut and open. It's almost a quantum effect. And they do this rhythmically. So when a substance attaches, a neurotransmitter attaches to the receptor side, it opens, shuts, opens, shuts, opens, shuts. And the speed that it opens and shuts is within the human audible range. That's amazing, isn't it? It actually makes sound, but it's so low that we can't hear it. Otherwise, we'd hear all this clatter going on in our body all the time with all our cell membranes. But it's within the audible frequency. So you can imagine then the effect of something like heavy metal music, which would interfere with that opening and shutting, or the effect of, say, classical music or jazz, which might be symbiotic or resonate with that and aid the healing, aid the opening and shutting of the cell membranes. So we can use colour and we can use sound to improve the energy balance. So there's many ways that we're going to do this, but these are two ways that we can think of straight away. As we go down the chart, and these wavelengths get very long, as you can see now they're almost the distance between us and the sun, the frequencies here are 440 here within the audible range. Here's the upper range, which is reduced with age in the lower. And remember that animals, particularly we know that dogs, can hear in this range. Okay? But we could be subject to this range and not know about it because we can't hear it. In other words, you could be hearing but not hearing consciously sounds. So somebody could send an ultrasound signal through here and it could disturb our brain function. In fact, many years ago they used these to disperse crowds in riots in Northern Ireland. And they were banned because they ended up with epilepsy in a lot of people. So we have a big crowd and they fire ultrasound at them and this disturbs their brain function and they can do it permanently. So imagine if you're receiving wavelengths from electrical equipment or other sound devices, which you can't audibly hear, but they could be interfering with our neurological function here. Down here, on the very, very low ones here, we go from about 16 down to 1 hertz. These are the very low ones. And what we find here between 16 and about 12 is what's called the beta frequencies, of which the brain works in when we're awake. So when we're wide awake, we're functioning and firing on all cylinders. We're operating between 12 and 16 cycles per second, called beta. When we're going between 8 and 12, we're in a relaxed state, pre-sleep, more like a meditative state, called alpha brain waves. And when we're between 4 and 8, we're in theta, which is usually the early sleep period, the land of illusion, when we're dreaming a lot. And then finally, between 1 and 4 hertz is the delta, which is the deep sleep, which is the deep healing type of sleep. Now, it's quite interesting here, and because the newborn child, certainly between the time of birth and age 2, only functions in the delta wavelength. They don't operate in these higher wavelengths because the brain hasn't developed in the higher fields. The cortexes haven't come alive yet. So at this point of 1 to 2, we're very much in an unconscious state, deep sleep. Between 2 and 6, we operate more in the theta range as well as the delta. And the theta and the delta are still within the sleep state. So there's no consciousness really with the infant child, but there's lots of input through the 5 senses, and they're filling their database. This is the time when you can impregnate a child with your doctrine, okay, as some schools do. Give me a child at age 7, says the Jesuit, and I'll make him into a priest for life, okay? Because you can influence. What the child does at this age is they're taking information from their parents, their teachers and their preachers. And as a result of that, what's happening is they're formulating their ideas within their memory base. Now, 50 years on, they're in a stressful state. How do they react? They react just as they were programmed to, because there's nobody in there. It's just a database playing. It's a tape recording. So when we're under stress, we always go back to the same pattern. And what was that pattern? It was the pattern we put in, which we listened through our influence of our peer groups around us. So between 6 and 12, we start to come into a field of consciousness, early conscious development, called alpha brainwaves. So these are the relaxed part. And then at about 12, we start to operate in our frontal cortexes, or our thinking or conscious parts, into the beta. So at 12 is a very good time to change schools. So the difference between a primary school and a senior school occurs around age 11, 12, because the child's now coming into that point when it can start to operate and to think. Whereas under that, they're just receiving information. They're not expected to think on a deeper level. Does that mean after 12, that's it? Learning's complete? No. Okay. The frontal brain, the frontal cortex has been shown to continue to actually grow and produce neurons until age 25. But now with stem cell research, it's shown that it goes on all the time. And that in fact, by the end of the day, you will have produced probably tens of thousands of new neurons, which is good news. The bad news is that the toxins and the free radicals generated because of all that makeup that you've been using and all the deodorants and the shaving creams and the shampoos and things and the environmental pollutants has probably destroyed 10 times that number. But the good news, even when you destroy a lot of them, is you've got a lot of neurons in there which will last you a good couple of hundred years, or should do. Okay? But you can speed the process up and go gaga at a much earlier age, okay, with practice. And that means a lot more toxins and a lot more inflammation, and especially, as we'll see, poor diet in the main component of the brain. And the brain is principally one particular component, one food compound, more than anything else, and that's called fat or oils. Okay, so these are a critical part of our functioning within our whole cellular structure, and especially our brains. Now, we might have observed, and this is when I used to teach at the British School of Osteopathy years ago, and this is the first thing we taught people in anatomy in the first year, is that you're a different shape. You know, kids coming in at age 18 are unaware of the biological differences, but they do know that some people are smaller, and some people are taller, and some are wider, and some are thinner. And these have been designated by different names during periods of time, and we're going to use a similar sort of terminology, but we're going to have an easy way using muscle testing of diagnosing which body type you are through the colours. Now we know that light, and that's not light in this room, remember this is not daylight in this room, this as you can see is a very yellow light, but when we go outside, particularly on a bright day, that's real white light. Light is the primary source of energy in the universe, and it's essential for all forms of life. Not just us, but it's obviously essential for the plant kingdom, and then the animals eat the plant, we eat the plants and the animals, and so we develop our sources of energy. Without light, no life could exist in either the plant or the animal kingdoms, and even deep sea creatures generate light. They have to have light. But interestingly, the fish don't see with the same visual connections to the brain and the cone conductivity that we do. They don't see red. Red is part of the red end of the spectrum. They see the blue, and they actually look in ultraviolet. So they see a different world underwater than what we see, because they can see into the ultraviolet world. They don't need the red, because the red doesn't penetrate the water, but they would need to see in the more invisible realms in the depths of the ocean where the light that we see doesn't enter. So life depends upon light, as we know. Without light, we'd all be dead. But it also we depend upon oxygen. So oxygen is a very important component to our life, because oxygen supplies us the ultimate nutrient for our production of energy. But unfortunately, light, along with oxygen, also ages and kills us through oxidative damage. So when we want to preserve us and preserve our foods, we want something to remove light and remove oxygen. These are the basis of food preservation. So to make our foods last longer, we dry them or we hide them away in the dark, and we try and remove as much oxygen, and certainly the combination of the two. So here we see an example of You can totally abuse yourself in your life, providing you have the right attitudes and beliefs. And as long as your belief is that smoking will not harm you, there'll be no problem. But directly someone said you shouldn't smoke because you'll get lung cancer, you probably will get lung cancer because you've already put that in your mindset. Or I mustn't smoke, you start feeling guilty because you smoke. But this has done this lady obviously no harm whatsoever. But we can say the bits about the aging process with 100 years of age probably are very common. She's got a bit of osteoarthritis, you can see the fingers there. She's got greying of the hair, she's got some melanin pigmentation on the face. But the good thing is she's enjoying her life. The parts that age first are the parts exposed to the lights. And this is really critical because these are the bits where you say, this person is 100 years of age or this person is 20. And that is the face. You can usually tell the age of a person from the face. And we'll have a look at a few people later on. The hands and the legs. So these would be the bits which you need to take care of. So the more protection you can do of the skin on the face and the hands and the legs, the more you're going to preserve your skin for later on. The skin on your bottom ages last. And the reason for that is because it doesn't get the light very often, okay? And when it does, it's usually indoors and not outdoors, okay? But if you have a look at somebody who's sat in the sun too much, particularly if they've stripped off, then they age quickly. If you notice how people who live in the Mediterranean or go to the Mediterranean a lot, like we used to do in the 1960s and didn't take any precautions in any way, of how much older those people look than people who take more care. Now, we do know that some people are more sensitive to the light than others. So biologically, some people react very much to the blue end of the spectrum, and other people can sit there and it does them a lot of good. So we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of people there are. So light, or white light, as I said, is outside, is composed of an equal blend of red, green, and blue. Now, these are the three primary colours associated with light in optics. When you paint, it's red, yellow, and blue. And from red, yellow, and blue, you can make all colours. But in optics, it's red, green, and blue, which are the three prime colours. These three colours are also the sensitivities of the human cones, which are the receptors in the retina of the eye and the macula of the eye, which pick up colour. We have three of these. Possibly evidence indicates we may have a fourth one, which one particular television company has now introduced a fourth chrome colour into their TV for this reason, okay, which they're bringing in yellow. So that's already been bought in. But the television set will normally be three colours. And if you get really close to the television set, you'll see three coloured dots. And from those three colours of dots, we make up beautiful pictures. But there are limitations in the digital camera and the television that there's certain colours that you can see that the camera can't. You can see it, you photograph it, and when you look at the picture, it doesn't come out the same. Okay? And that's because the television is set to mid-range in the spectrum, mid-range, red, green, and blue. And the human cone is not set mid-range for this reason. So we get a much broader variety of colours. So the human cones are offset. So pure red is 625 nanometers, right up to 700. And the human cone is set at 619, which is more down towards the orange end. So the red cone, so-called red cone in the human eye, is more towards the orange end. The green cone is set towards the yellow end of green, which is at 550, but the blue cone is set more towards the violet end of the spectrum at 440. So this gives us a wider variety of colours that we can see. We're able, in fact, to see those deep red, peony red colours in the red end of the spectrum, which the photograph can't pick up. But most importantly is the camera can't pick up gold. Okay, it can't detect gold. It picks it up as yellow. So when you take a picture of something which is gold, it comes out yellow. And the interesting thing is, why can we see gold and the camera can't? How can we reproduce it? And it's simply because our eyes are offset and we can make a greater blend of colours. So light through the eyes enables us to open our neurological pathways into specific brain structures. So the fastest way into the brain is through the eyes using different types of light stimulation. Light is the second most important environmental input after food. Light ignites cellular metabolism. In other words, light will wake us up in the morning and it'll liven us up, particularly if we use the right types of colour. So it stimulates our chemical messengers through the hypothalamus, which is the main connection of where the optic nerves go to first of all. And this in turn then produces our regulating hormones and neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters are sent to the important glands, the hormones, via the pituitary and also to the pineal gland to stimulate it when we don't have light and to inhibit it when we do. The glands in turn distribute the hormonal messages to the rest of the body. Now here we see light coming in the eyes. We see that half of the visual field crosses over to the other brain and half stays on the same side. So when we look through one eye only, we're actually looking into both brains and vice versa. So we know that the first collateral or nerve coming off from the optic nerves goes to the pineal gland, which regulates us for the day and night for our sleep, and the second to the lateral geniculus of the thalamus, in other words, the great regulator of all body systems, their neurological input. And then number 3 is to the visual cortex, which is at the back of the head in the cortical lobes. Number 4 to the superior colliculus. Number 5 is to the hypothalamus, which regulates then the autonomic system and the hormonal system. Number 6 to the parasympathetic Edinger-Westphal nucleus. 7 to the parietal lobe, where we experience the location of what we're looking at. And number 8 is the limbic system, is the emotion of what we see. So there's a lot of interaction within everything that we see, has a vast effect through most of the brain, from the hindbrain to the midbrain to the cortex. So how do we challenge for these? First of all, before anything else, we need to see whether the person's energy is up to scratch. In other words, they can begin to fire within their brain when they start to see colours. And what we're going to do first of all is we're going to challenge using the black acetate, or in other words, no visual input at all. And the best way to challenge for this is to put a piece of garden polythene, it's quite heavy and soft, over the eyes and simply do a muscle test. Now we've learned from experience that when somebody weakens to the black, this is usually an indication their vitality or chi is down, and they need some form of therapy to help boost them up. And we're going to look at what all those different therapies are that will boost them up. Everybody who has an infection and a heavy toxin load which is overpowering the body is because the energy of the body is too low. They cannot recover, and so therefore they've got low vitality, and we'll see that the cause of this is usually something in their mind, but it's more their unconscious mind. In other words, they're not necessarily consciously thinking about this, but that anger and that guilt and that grief and that low self-esteem is the underneath cause of why their vitality is low. And we'll see that amazingly this association with these sort of emotions can be handed on from one person to another. And boy, don't we know that in our clinics when you've had certain patients come into your treatment room and you feel, whoa, you just lost 20% of your vitality's gone down. And how do you build that back up for the next patient? You know, you can get really drained for the rest of the day as a result of that. And what's interesting is the patient goes out, but when you go back into that room, it still has that feeling. You know, and you don't like going back into your own room. And you feel, well, do I open the doors? Do I open the windows? And we want something which we can help get rid of that atmosphere that the person's left, because otherwise it resonates there. And we've all been in houses when you look for houses to buy and you thought, no, I don't want this house. There's something wrong with this house. So we want to know how to overcome that, in other words, these negative or unconscious fields. So the first challenge here is the black. So if I could borrow you again. I don't mean to pick on you, but it's just that you're handy and we've got all the data on you now. So what we're doing is we're building up a dossier. What's your Christian name?
Costas.
Costas. Okay. Right. So just close your eyes and pull. So Costas has passed the first test. Okay. So you stay there. Okay. So he doesn't weaken to black in the clear, nothing else put on there. So at this stage, his vitality appears to be good, and we're not going to go into the cause of this, which is the unconscious type of emotions, negative emotions that he's associating with, are not relevant to his history at the moment. But by the end of the day, we'll have him. Okay? We'll show you that where his problems are, his 20% down, is in his unconscious mind, or his conscious mind, his thinking, is where the problem emanates from. But I'll show you how we get there. Now, there's a way of jump-starting that and finding out what that is right now, but we'll talk about that later on. Because what his body is indicating, the way to handle him is to do more the physical, subconscious and chemical side and the structure first. Don't touch the unconscious, because it's like opening Pandora's box. the time is not right. Okay? And we'll understand why the time is not right as we go along. So he's passed the first test. Okay, now, jumping from here, we now know that his vitality is good enough to get going. We will challenge him with the 3 cones. Now, these 3 cones I've used for, I don't know, 10, 15 years now. They're made of computer-generated from acetates, of which are then laminated. So if you get your sticky fingers on there, there's no need to worry. You can clean them off with water. And also, if you just print the the acetate on the computer, you will have ink on it. And of course, when you put it there and you take it off, and then you leave a smudge of ink on the patient or on your fingers. So they must be laminated. These are available if anybody hasn't got these already. So our first test will be, let's say, using the red cone, pull. And we find he remains nice and strong. So neurologically, this is not having an effect on his autonomic nervous system or subconscious. So we'll test him with the green cone. And he doesn't weaken to the green cone, so he's all right in the red. He's not in the red, not in the green. But that only leaves one, doesn't it? Okay, so pull. So he weakens to the blue. So we would have called him a blue and looked at the body type associated with this. But we now know that people are mixes often. Sometimes they're not mixes, but very frequently they're mixes of different body types. Maybe, you know, mum was a red and dad was a blue. So you're not quite a typical of that particular shape. So let's have a look. We'll put now the blue acetate over the right eye and leave the left eye with no stimulation in it. And we find, oh, he's nice and strong on the right eye. But the left eye, you just hold that there. He's got one of those shapes of heads. Okay. The left eye weakens to the blue. So of the 3 acetates, the blue is the one that weakens him generally, but it's actually only the left eye that weakens, okay, which takes him there. That means the right eye is not sensitive to blue, so it must be sensitive to one of the other colours. So let's try now putting the red on the right eye. We know his left eye is the dominant one as far as this is concerned, and he's nice and strong on the right eye with the red, but he weakens to the green. Okay, so his body type, therefore, we can put down is blue, dominant, on his left eye, and we don't call it recessive, we call it less dominant on his right eye, is with green. So he's a blue-green. This means he's got characteristics of both types, but predominantly at this stage, blue. Okay. Now, this is very interesting because blue people have particular characteristics, which I'm going to teach you about. And these characteristics are very important because people who are blue often are more liable to pick up infections. When he's operating more from his green aspect, he probably won't get an infection. But people who have a blue, even a touch of blue, will become the dominant colour when they've got an infection. Okay? Doesn't mean that red people never get infections, but they hardly ever in comparison. You don't find red people get infections very much. They can do, but it's mostly when you operate and you find it's where they've gone into the blue. So you can change from blue to green. He's not likely to change to red. He hasn't got an ounce of red in him at the moment, but he's principally at this stage. Now that can change because we could fix his blue part up, and that only leaves the green. Okay, so he could become a predominantly green if we only dealt with his blue. Okay? So what we now know is that his left eye is green and his right eye is blue. Okay? So when we talk about complementary colours or healing colours to him, we'll see that we need to use the complementary colour of the blue on the left and the green on the right. Okay? So you make a note of that, will you? In case we go and forget later on. Okay, so that's his body type. Fab, thank you. So what we just demonstrated there really was what we've been doing for the last 10 or so years, about taking it to a slightly different level to say that there's a blend. And the possible blends are that you could be red and red. I'm red, I weaken to red practically all the time, but only in one eye, the left eye, and the left eye happens to be, in this case, my dominant one in relationship to my body type. My right eye weakens to green, which means I'm principally red with a touch of green. Okay? I'd rather be red, because I don't like that touch of green, because it can get me down sometimes, because green people have particular characteristics which, if I don't address sometimes, can lower my state of being. But we could also be blue. Whoops. We could also be blue. So we could be red in one eye and blue in the other. So we've got characteristics again of both. Greens can be green, green, red, or green, blue. And blues can be blue, blue, or true blues, blue, red, and blue, green, of course. So there's different combinations of possibilities there. So you need to test with both eyes and find out which is the dominant, and if there is a less dominant one, which side that is. So let's have a look at the body types. And these we've expanded through the period of time. And you'll now find that red people are more what in biotypes are endomorphs, okay, and in Ayurvedic medicine these are called kapha. Okay, now what?
Do we have this? Not really, do we?
Don't worry if you haven't got them. All of this will be on the website for you to download. Okay, so you've got the essential bits to use as far as your workshopping with now and your patients. Everything that I put on here you can download, okay, at your expense. Okay, your paper. We're conserving paper. So, now, one thing that is new here, the dominating gland for red people is the thyroid. And when you see what happens with red people, you'll say, that's a symptom of thyroid problem. Okay? So you have to remember, every time a person weakens to red, okay, they will strengthen to thyroid, either the tissue extract or therapy localization against the thyroid. Okay? So if you use a thyroid tissue extract or therapy localization, you will find that they strengthen against the thyroid. So the dominating gland in a red person's life is the thyroid. These people have a strong affinity to aluminium, which we'll have a look why that is in a minute. And we need to get rid of the aluminium continually. So aluminium foil, aluminium in all sorts of ways, which you've got all the information in there about where aluminium might come from deodorants, from medicines, etc. You found a lot of aluminium in autistic children, and they've looked for the vaccines. They used to use aluminium salts in the vaccines and things, and still do to some extent. But the biggest source of aluminium to the pregnant woman is antacids. So many women take antacid medication for heartburn, and they eat their antacid medication, which is full of aluminium. Okay, and of course they wonder then why that crosses the placenta and affects the child. So bear in mind that aluminium can come in different ways. So the best way we'll see to shift out toxic metals undoubtedly is a spice. Okay? We've tried herbs, we've tried chelating agents, all sorts of things, but nothing compares to a spice, because the spice will upregulate your cytochrome P450 and your phase 2 pathways to eliminate, as we'll see, all toxins. Homocysteine. Red people have high levels or a genetic tendency towards high homocysteine. And homocysteine inhibits the final production of collagen, which allows us to burst in our blood vessels and other locations. But we know that collagen is very important for holding our whole structure together, and we'll talk about collagen in relationship to the skin later on. So a need for vitamin B6 is very important with red people, especially if you've got high homocysteine. And the best source of vitamin B6, and you can show you how to test this with the foods, undoubtedly 100% with B6 is brown rice. Okay, brown rice is universally the best source of B6, but you must cook it so it's dry. Okay, the B6 is going to be in the water, all right? So if you then pour the rice through a civet and you drain the water, you will lose most of your B6. So with these, what you do is you cook it until it reabsorbs the water, and then you eat it, right? And that's the richest source of B6. It works better than anything else. We have low methyl tetrahydrofolate, so we have an increased risk of heart attacks. Okay? In other words, we don't recycle our homocysteine, so we always need to have plenty of folic. So B6 and folic acid, and the best source of folic acid undoubtedly is cabbage. And it doesn't matter what sort of cabbage, green, red, white, and again the golden rules apply. If you cook it, then you need to be able to drink the juice. If you have it raw, it doesn't matter. But if you cook it, then you need to have the juice as part of your gravy. We're positive to ApoE4 gene expression allele, and we know that ApoE4 predisposes us to higher levels of cholesterol, fragments in the body, and also to the increase in toxic metals, because ApoE4 gene, or ApoE4 lipoprotein, is a carrier of metals out of the system. So it takes cholesterol fragments and metals, and this is why we have a chance of building up our aluminium, and we now know that aluminium buildup can predispose to, in some ways, into Alzheimer's, which may be nothing to do with aluminium, but to do with these other factors that we're low in folate and low in B6, etc. But it just happens that we accumulate aluminium, and they found high levels of aluminium in Alzheimer's brains. So we have a tendency to cholesterol and triglycerides, and to modulate cholesterol, what we'll talk about a little later, and triglycerides, the best thing is the right types of oils in the diet. Remove the bad oils and substitute with the good oils. And we want to know which are those good oils. We require iodide or iodine for our immune systems, as well as our thyroid, of course. Best sources of iodine, undoubtedly, is nuts. Okay? Seafood is good, but seafood we'll also see can be contaminated. But nuts, particularly walnuts and peanuts, I know peanuts technically aren't a nut, but they're a very good source for those people who can tolerate it, of course, of iodine. And red people are naturally carnivores. They work better on a high-protein diet. They react to wheat lectin, so we're not very good on wheat. If we have to have wheat, it's better to have white flour products rather than wholemeal or spelt. We find that our thyroids are inhibited, and you can find this almost universally by bananas and by broccoli. So we've saved the day from eating broccoli, all right? We have medical reasons, sorry, I can't eat broccoli, because these inhibit our thyroid activity. Okay. So that's the red person. Okay, now the green person. The green is governed by their adrenals. Okay. The green is an adrenal cortical, not medulla, but a cortical problem. They are what is in the middle of the road type of body called a mesomorph, otherwise known as a eumorph to plusate the EU. So the EU has an EU morph, or eumorph, which is a mesomorph, the perfect person. In Ayurvedic medicine, this is called pitta, so this is the green person. They have a very strong affinity to nickel. Universally, they will tell you, yeah, I can't use cheap jewelry, buckles on my jeans irritate, anything nickel, watch straps, etc., will cause irritation, set up inflammation, sometimes in distant parts from where the metal is actually touching. Again, best detoxifier of metals, spice. They require bromide for their immune systems. Good source of bromide is walnuts. Okay, don't use too much. You know what happens when people had a lot of bromide in the days of national service? Okay. Chemically sensitive individuals, aren't they just? This is the nightmare. This is the person who doesn't have those cytochrome P450, 3A1, 3A2 pathways, which detoxify a whole range of drugs. They are difficult people with chemicals. They cannot detoxify. Genetically, they don't have the cytochrome P450s. They have to be very careful for additives in their diet and their environment. They're very sensitive to solanine foods. That's the deadly nightshade foods. Again, the solanines are the potatoes, the green peppers, the aubergines, chilies, etc., and tomatoes. So not too much of that. So pizza and chips is not a good idea for them. They are sensitive to sulfites. And as we know, sulfites are added as a preserver in wine to stop the yeast from fermenting when it travels. So again, detoxify the solanine foods and the sulfites out of the system. Find the spice for you. There will be, at the end of the day, a spice just for you, for your constitution, your body type. Trouble is, I can't tell you what it is. Okay? You'll have to test. You know, you could have one, you would have one, you would have one. Even though you may have the same body type, you've got to take into the individuality of it. And you will always find that that one spice is your spice of life. It will work in all occasions, including infectious diseases. And many times these people are sensitive to casein, which is the milk protein. It's not lactose, it's casein, but that's not 100%. So the main thing about a green person is nickel and chemical sensitivity. And finally, the blue cone is governed by their gonads. Okay? Okay. Everything about a blue person, women, is ovarian. It's the pain of their lives, all the way through their life. They are troubled from one thing to another down below there. And the same for the men. Okay, are troubled there universally by their gonads. They may not say, I've got problems with my gonads, but they've got problems with their testosterone, and that affects all their muscle systems throughout the whole body. So it has a universal effect. Doesn't mean it's going to be necessarily pain, disease, or whatever locally. It's wherever those hormones target through the receptor sites. And these receptor sites are universal, and especially in the brain for the men. Biggest target site apart from the willy is the brain for testosterone, isn't it, Paul? Yeah, okay. So, affinity to mercury. These people are a nightmare as far as mercury is concerned. And of course, we always think about mercury coming from fish. We keep thinking about mercury from amalgams, but mercury from amalgams is, in most people, is relatively stable unless they become too acid in their saliva. Sometimes people can have a multitude of amalgams in their mouth and they're perfectly stable. They're there for years. They have them for years and years and years. But when they eat certain foods, they get a metallic-y taste. And when their body system and reflected in their saliva becomes too low, in other words, below 6 in their pH, they may start to dissolve. But that, in most people's case, or a lot of these difficult cases, is not the main source of mercury, surprisingly. Main source of mercury is fish. Okay. Fish do not have the ability, the detoxification enzymes, to get rid of metals, particularly mercury. We all heard about tuna, haven't we? And the tuna is a dry fish. It doesn't have much fat. So where most fish store their metals is in their fat. So the biggest source of mercury for most people is taking omega-3 oils, fish oil. Be very, very, very careful. When you start to use the complementary colors to test people from strength, you will find people will weaken who are blue to fish oil, universally. And when you cross-check it with homeopathic mercury, it'll always be mercury that does it. Okay? I'm a red, no problems at all. If you're a green, no problems at all. But if you're a blue, either as the main part or the less dominant one, my advice is do not touch fish oil. Use vegetable oil instead, because you will accumulate low doses, very, very small doses over a period of time. Okay? So over a long period of time, low doses of toxic metals will accumulate in your brain and your nervous system over a long period of time, because you simply cannot get rid of it on its own. If you want to get rid of it with a patient, again, think of the spice, think of any method which detoxifies, but you'll come to the conclusion that the best way of doing it, which university shows, is the spice for you. Krill is awful, just the same, I'm afraid. Test it against only with blue people. All right? Everybody else can tolerate it, but krill and other forms of omega-3 oils and the fish themselves. Blue people shouldn't eat too much fish. A little bit is okay, but generally not too much, especially the oily ones. Okay? Pollution from mercury is all over the world. We blame the Japanese, we blame the Americans and so on, but these oceans move around. And the amount of mercury in the sea is very, very small, but every bit that that fish swallows and takes through, it can't, and absorbs, it can't get rid of it. Okay? And it's the same with you. And that's why fish are on the blue end of the spectrum, which I told you earlier. They just don't have the ability to get rid of mercury. If fish swam on the surface and had red cones, they wouldn't have a problem, as long as they keep clear of aluminium containers. Okay? So, they're low, not in fish and chip shops, in other words. Okay, so low methylene tetrahydrofolate, which is one of the coenzymes of folic acid, and this is associated with a higher risk of cancer, of genetic mutations. So these people need to have more methylene tetrahydrofolate, in other words, the cabbage, and also more B12. You find that B12 is very, very often low because these people naturally are more vegetarians. They don't eat very much and don't tolerate very much red meat, so they don't get enough B12. But we see that B12, although it's not present in spinach, spinach contains the enzyme to activate B12 into the two active coenzymes. So here we see we're using a lot of vegetables in our diet, partly because they contain the nutrient or the mineral, but also they contain the enzymes. And these enzymes from spinach can activate your folate into your methylene tetrahydrofolate, or in the case of spinach, into the adenosylcobalamin and the methylcobalamin. They require chlorides by their immune system, so seafood from that point of view is good, but not too much of the oily fish. They're natural vegetarians because they have low levels of hydrochloric acid, so they can't digest high red meats. They do react, though, universally to milk lactose. So these people should not take lactose as milk or yogurts, but they're fine with butter and they're fine with cheese, because those are proteins and fats and water and not the lactose. So the first thing you do with a blue person is ask them, do you drink milk? Because they'll have, if they complain about their gut, get them off milk first of all. Put them onto a non-lactose form. Because milk contains insulin-like growth factor 1, and this is of bovine source, and bovine insulin-like growth factor 1 is identical to human insulin growth factor 1, which is a promoter of tumours. Okay, it's a growth marker for tumours. So this is why blues already have this predisposition, especially with the ovaries and the estrogens and things. Get them off the milk, because the milk is naturally high in estrogens anyway from the cow, but it's this insulin-like growth factor. Now, and this was the real blow, okay? They are alcohol intolerant. They genetically do not have alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme, or a very allele that is a very low expression. And they will tell you they cannot tolerate alcohol. 1 or 2 drinks and they've had it, okay? Now, some of them can really persist and get real bad headaches if they continue, and some are a little bit more tolerant. But the good news is the healthier you are, in other words, the cleaner you are in your system, particularly your liver, then you can tolerate a little alcohol with no problem. But you can't tolerate the alcohol if you're all clogged up. One drink and most of them choose not to drink alcohol because they say, I know, I don't feel very well, I'd rather not bother. Okay? So the one who can't tolerate alcohol at all has a bigger problem, obviously, than the one who said, yeah, I can have 1 or 2 glasses. The red person, remember, can almost tolerate anything. Okay? So wine, spirits. The green person is not very good with chemicals. So wines are not very good, and beers, because they're full of sulfites and other chemicals, but spirits are clean. Okay, so the green person moved to your gin and your scotch and things like that. But the blue person, the good thing about being married to a blue person is they're cheap to take out, okay, because they'll have a soft mineral water or drink, but they won't have the alcohol very well. Otherwise, you're going to have to carry them home. Okay, but they make great for driving the car home. Great drivers. Okay, the alcohol intolerance. Now this has one very important implication. One very important implication in our work is that many of the testing substances that we use are alcohol-based. Okay, so I'm going to tell you how you can get around this, because alcohol, like anything, has a spectroscopic emission. It is a compound, and every atom has a spectroscopic emission. In other words, a light frequency that it displays or emits, and what we've got to do is find the equal and opposite. Just as every one colour that we've talked about, those 3 colours, has an equal and opposite or a complementary colour, so does alcohol. And if you use this complementary colour, you can then use the testing kits, all right. So we call this an alcohol or ethanol inhibitor. Because I don't know whether you found this, but through the years I found this, that my blue patients are my nightmares. The ones I cannot get right, or are very, very difficult to find out the source of what it is, are the blue patients. And I struggled and struggled and struggled. And I had one patient who plainly had iodine deficiency. They had a thyroid problem, their whole metabolism was slow, their body temperature was slow. They had all the symptoms of hypothyroid. They tested on the thyroid, cross-checked. Everything was thyroid. This patient was blue, so they had obviously a touch of red in them, but they were principally blue. And I used the simulated copy of the iodine, no strengthening whatsoever, and I couldn't understand this. And then, perchance, I used the actual iodine itself. So a vial containing iodine, natural iodine, and they strengthened. I thought, this is strange. Perhaps I've lost the simulation, so I re-simulated in thinking it had gone blank in my eye, and it still didn't work. And it got me scratching for a day or 2, and then suddenly the penny dropped, and that eureka moment came. It's alcohol. And I found it another patient couldn't tolerate alcohol, was blue. Okay? Then I thought, oh, hold on, I'm testing with alcohol. And then I found putting the complementary colour to the blue on, which is this yellow-greeny colour here, they all weakened to every test marker. I thought, oh no, there's a fault, or there's a flaw here that we're going to have to override the effect of the alcohol. So what we discovered was the frequency range, or wavelength range rather, of which negates the effect of ethanol, specifically of just ethanol. So with blue people, you must use this ethanol inhibitor, and then when you find you've got to use that, you'll be able to use the kits perfectly well. Okay? So it made me think, well, now we can move on. And we started to find things then, like the case with the iodine, which we missed. Blatantly obvious things, and the same with the mercury. We couldn't find that mercury specifically was good for, homeopathic was good for a person because it was made of alcohol. But once you start using the alcohol inhibitor wavelength, then you start to pick all these things up, and blues don't become such a nightmare in your patients anymore. But you must remember, every time you've tested a person who's blue, my advice is don't forget to use the alcohol inhibitor. You can just leave it on, because if you do, you won't find the answer. Okay? You'll be scratching your head and you'll miss something really, really important, because they simply won't strengthen to something containing alcohol. Okay? So bear that in mind. It's very, very important. Now, they're also very sensitive, blue people, to pesticides. And most pesticides, like we saw at the beginning with the raid with the flies, are estrogen mimics. And these are the big nightmares in our world, is estrogen. And estrogen, we'll see, attaches to estrogen receptors on the cells. And these receptors are not just in the gonads and the breast tissue in the female. They're in males. It's called sex hormone receptors. And we have them all over. And the estrogen will attach in the male as well as the testosterone. And if there's lacking of testosterone due to some toxicity, estrogen will build up and attach to the receptors. So the estrogen level will get higher than the testosterone level. But these estrogen receptors are in the intestines, they're in the lung tissue, and they're in the brain. So more or less every cell in the body, we discover, has receptor sites for particular hormones or chemical messengers. And what happens now is you've got something which has the same key that locks onto that antennae in the cell membrane, will cause disturbance. And it'll lock onto that receptor. And the thing about these chemicals is they lock onto the receptor, but they don't work. Okay? They're able to fit in to there and jam it. Okay? They're like having the wrong size sort of key. They get in there, but they don't turn the receptor and activate the entrance, the efferent receptor, to get it to work. And they don't shift. They don't just go on and off like the proper stuff does. So what happens is it blocks the receptor. Along comes the real neurotransmitter or neuropeptide, and it can't get on. So what happens is the estrogen level builds up. Estrogen builds up and it goes to wherever it can target. So the worst thing is to block your estrogen receptors with estrogen mimickers and then have high levels of estrogen floating around. Okay? So we need to know what these estrogen-like substances or xenobiotics are. And practically all pesticides are these. So this is why eating food which you haven't got rid of the pesticides, or ideally eating organic food, is very, very important, particularly if you're a blue person. Because remember, there's the history of cancer, and nothing works faster as an estrogen receptor mimicker than pesticides. Now, this is a spectroscopic emission and absorption. This is the same thing, but just like a negative of the same thing. So absorption means it absorbs light from a metal or an atom, and the emission is where it gives it out. And all objects give out light when they're in an excited or heated state, and all objects will absorb light when they're in a ground state or unactivated. So here we see on the bottom the emission, in other words the output. We see this very, very strong output in the orange to red frequency or wavelength here at 619 nanometers. This is exactly the same line as the human cone, the red cone, which is why red people have an affinity and inability to get rid of aluminium. And we see it in the absorption, like the negative effect of that in the black line here and the orange one there. If we go to nickel with the green people, again we see right on 550, we see this absorption emission in the spectroscopic emission of nickel. And then you see on mercury, the big one there, is the absorption and emission at 440, which is exactly the wavelength of the blue cone, which remember is offset towards the violet end. Now, I talked very briefly about the three colours, and we know that the three colours of light are red, green and blue. Now, if we remove red from the spectrum, we're left with green and blue. Okay? And when we add green and blue together, we get turquoise, or otherwise known as cyan. So cyan is the remaining part of the whole spectrum in supplementing in addition to the red. So if you remove the red from there, all the other colours would make cyan or turquoise. Okay? So turquoise is the opposite or complementary colour to red. So when we add red to turquoise, we get all three colours and then we get white light. Okay? So this, in other words, is the good thing with a person. Okay? A red person will strengthen to the complementary colour because it makes the complete spectrum or light wave band to balance their energy. So this would be the healing colour for a red person. Okay? So if I'm a red person and I've got a bad neck or I've got a tummy upset, somewhere where you might have a positive therapy localization, you will find by putting this on and the therapy localization is negated. So what we suggest is you have 15 minutes of the light. So don't worry about having tea and coffee. You can forget that, you know. You all go out into the sunshine out there and put the complementary colours on. 15 minutes in the light. Do not look at the sun, otherwise you'll come back blinded. Okay, but just you go out into the light with your complementary colours. Now, for the green person, the complementary colour, if you remove green from the spectrum, you're left then with blue and red, which makes magenta or like a purpley colour. But, unfortunately, the green in the human eye is offset more towards the yellow, so this makes it more towards the blue end of the spectrum. So this bluey violet colour one is the complementary to green, all right? Simply because the green is offset towards the yellow, so it's not a true offset. And then finally, the complementary colour to the violet or blue cone is set towards the yellow end of green. So this one here, which says complement to blue, is the good colour for blue people. So what do you do if you're red and green? Is you simply get your two complementary acetates, right, your red one and your green one, and you put a paper clip across there to hold them together. Real high-tech stuff, and then you put them across your eyes. Okay? And then you can lie down outside or just sit out there in the bright light. Ideally, the brighter the light, the better. And you need 15 minutes of the complementary colour. Now, knowing that these complementary colours are very healing, it's the wavelength. As soon as you put this on, people say, wow, you know, I really feel good. I see, you know, blue and reds everywhere, but I feel really much invigorated. And they are, because they got the healing light. If you were to put red on me, I would feel worse, because it would deplete me, because it's a stress to my neurological system. So what I need to do is take the red out of the light wave band, and also the green. So by putting those two on, I get them pure white light. I had one patient the other week who I did this for, and he said, oh, wow, he said, I can see your aura now. Isn't that interesting? He was a bit psychic anyway, but I said, oh, that's interesting. What colour is it? So you can see all sorts of things if you use the complementary colour, because it completes the part. So if you did nothing else for your patient, but just gave them 15 minutes, you don't have to be on a light box. It works better with a light box, but you can just go out into the bright light. The brighter the light, the better. All right? Now, because this is a wavelength, you can actually copy this. So what we've done is simply copy these colours and put them into vials. But instead of using alcohol for the reason that we just stated, we've used activated charcoal. Now, I learned this in Russia a couple of years ago. A Russian physician came out to me. He said, why do you use alcohol, Chris? And I said, because it's very stable and it seems to withstand magnetic fields, etc. He said, yeah, but he said, and this is a Russian talking about alcohol, he said it might be bad for the person. And it probably is the amount of vodka that they can drink. But there are, he said, people who cannot take alcohol, you know, Chris. So I said, yeah, I know. And we often meet people who can't do that and say naturally, you know, they react to alcohol. And so I thought and things take quite some time to drop sometimes with me, as you'll see about the spices. So 2 years later, I thought, we need an alternative to alcohol. What is the best? So we use activated charcoal. So activated charcoal works much better. There's no alcohol in it. It's very stable. But if you use a simulator to make these at all, it takes much longer to simulate into activated charcoal than it does into alcohol. All right? So you might want to leave it in about 30 seconds to copy as opposed to 5 seconds, just to make absolutely sure. All right? But they are very stable, and you can work freely then with blue people with no fear that they're going to react in any way to the alcohol. So you'll find that the test substance is black, but you don't actually get it on your hands, but it's a bit of a pig putting it into the vials, as you can imagine. So we can use the complementary colours or the frequency. So you could put that frequency into the patient's medicine or remedy that you want to give them. So say, for instance, you wanted to give them a liquid, you know, maybe a mineral compound, maybe a spice or a herb, a homeopathic. What you would do is you would put it in using, in addition, their complementary colour. That gives them their vitality. Now, I talked briefly about something to improve people's vitality, which I'll tell you what we've designed, and to put the complementary colour into this spray to improve your vital energy and to protect yourself from negative energies, I would always put in the complementary colour of the patient. And yourself, of course, you know, if you're going to protect yourself from the evils of your patients. All right? So, let's have a look. I think that's probably a good time to stop there, Gary.